Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste.
Namaste, and happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue today our series, part 3, on the same subjects, dreams, visions, out-of-body experiences. And we will start with a comment that we received from Shanta last time on Korat Alvar example.
Yes. When we were speaking of memory and the ability to be able to recall everything from the subliminal mind, in the chat box, Shanta had put this Kuratalvar example. And while reading, I couldn't quite recall what it was. So I thought it useful to draw upon this as a reference. This is a very famous incident where a very well-known and highly respected saint of the south, Sri Ramanujacharya, had traveled all the way to Kashmir to have access to a particular text, which were called the musings of Bodhayana. Vritti is the term, musings. And Bodhayana is, his musings were known as Brahma Sutras. I'm drawing largely from Wikipedia. And he wanted to make a commentary for which he wanted to read this text. And going there was some resistance from the scholars there, and they did not allow him to take notes from the text. He was only allowed to read. On the way back, it's a long journey, which is made largely on foot. And so having come back, so much had been lost as if from the memory. But it turns out his primary disciple, Kuratalvar, had been able to memorize entirely the whole text. And obviously, maybe one reading or a couple of readings were enough for him to be able to retain word for word. And so, as a result, Ramanujacharya could complete his commentary on the Brahma Sutras. So this is a famous example given. And the point I wanted to make in relation to this, which was part of our discussion, in all of us, within our subliminal mind, there is total recall. There is no exception to this. That's the nature of the subliminal mind. You will find Sri Aurobindo's writings on education. He speaks of two memories. There is the automatic memory, and he says, and there's the conscious memory. The automatic memory is perfect already. It does its job irrespective. And it's the conscious memory which has to be trained on how to access the automatic memory. And we discussed that last time. But the important thing with regard to this incident of Kuratalvar is it was in the context of a spiritual path. Kuratalvar was a disciple of Ramanujacharya, highly developed spiritually. And as a result of the spiritual development, this capacity had come. There are people who have it without the spiritual development. And you're given a name, eidetic memory, I think it's called. But always it comes from a prior life in which this capacity had been developed, or occasionally it comes from in this life where there is a physical damage to the link in between, or to the brain, or something in the inner nervous system, where suddenly as if gates open abnormally and there is an access. The better thing, of course, for us is to be able to consciously integrate sufficiently that we are able to have that access and the continuity of the memory. The point for us, from a spiritual point of view, it's not that your memory and your intelligence have to be developed by a long process as science teaches us. So science will say, yes, so-and-so is more intelligent, so-and-so is genius, and you must now build your capacity. You're told this, study, learn, read in school. And as a result, you will grow more intelligent, you'll develop your capacity for memory, you'll develop, etc. Yes, it does work, but that's not the true secret. It works because in trying to do these things, the inner capacity which is already existent now gets a chance to, so to say, leak out. So it's a very indirect method. The more direct method would be you consciously turn your awareness inward, upward, until you are able to integrate with the inner and higher parts and let them flow into the outer and lower parts. And immediately your memory capacity will shoot up, your intelligence capacity will shoot up to at least a genius level and possibly more, and all other faculties similarly. Since we are talking about the mind, it's limited to what the mind can do. But an equivalent exists in the inner vital and even in the inner physical. And to the extent that you're able to open to the inner vital and the inner physical at those levels and integrate sufficiently, the capacities latent to those levels proper now begin to infuse into the outer. And Sri Aurobindo actually says this is actually what happens in evolution. Evolution is nothing but the latent abilities in the inner realms now being organized in the surface layers. And the surface layer is characterized by the fixation in the biology. Now, the fixation, when our consciousness identifies with the physical body, that fixation can become extremely rigid to a point where, as if we lose all memory of the inner and higher things, we've forgotten why we took birth. But also we lose with it all the abilities which are natural to the inner layers. But with that fixation also can come such a dulling that we even forget to try to recall and turn entirely outwards. And this is the great loss. But if the inner being is strong enough, it keeps nudging, pulling, and begins to make this turn and movement, or infuses from within certain experiences and so on. And that's how our spiritual journey typically begins. But if from the beginning we understood the psychology and made the effort to turn within and above and build that link, and made that even the basis for our educational training, not just of mind, but of the vital and the physical, then so much more can be achieved in a very short time. In other words, what would be a long, slow process of evolution for the outer layers through this indirect method could be enormously accelerated by the opening to the inner and higher. Just opening to the inner would open you to a level which we may call mystic. Opening to the higher would open you to a level which we may call more spiritual. But in effect, the procedure or the process for both is exactly the same. Again, to the inward opening, we use indirect methods, typically, what people use as mantras or various practices and rituals. They're all indirect methods. And we can do the same thing by a direct turning of awareness and then plunging within. And we have discussed the indirect methods in the series of discussions from the evening series number 82 onwards, where we go into the deeper aspects of practice. So those of you who have not seen those, do look at it. We can go to the next question.
One letter we had received from Tutun. Decades back, I had a dream where I saw my son, a little boy of 1-2 years, falling in the running water of a river. I got scared and watched him fall and moving away due to the strong force of the water. Even in the dream, I felt fear, due to which I was not able to jump in the river and rescue him. When I got up, I was deeply distressed, in agony, and angry at myself not being able to rescue my son. That I got scared that I would die if I had to jump in the running water. Ironically, I'm a very good swimmer in real life. I cried and prayed so much that day. Prayed that the dream reappears again and I will be given the opportunity to make the necessary changes. Evening, I meditated, became calm. By that time, I was already initiated into Parahamsa Yogananda, initial meditation techniques. I started concentrating on the dream and I was very calm, prayed for the dream to reappear again. That night, the same dream appeared. Saw my son falling into the river. The water flow was very strong, but I jumped into the river to pick the boy up. And what happens is astonishing. The water level is just my knee height, and I easily pick up my son, who is happy and safe. In real life, after dream, my son and me were put in life situations where I had to put my energy, focus, and sacrifice for my son. and those years were very stressful. I had to single-handle by the responsibility for him. But today, after 12 years, I can say everything went out smoothly and successful for my son.
It's an interesting example of a dream and an intervention that took place in a dream. And I've kept the whole thing in some detail because there are many lessons one can draw from this example and certain nuances of the example. So you see, first of all, that as a mother, her child is falling in a running river. She experiences fear in the dream. Although in real life she is a good swimmer, the fear comes up to a degree that the force of the water and the strength of the force triggering a fear that she is unable to jump and rescue. Now think about what this means. In physical life, had it happened, she would have jumped because she knows she is a swimmer. In the dream state, she is not able to jump. Why would that be? And I want to take this point as a reference for understanding the importance of these kinds of dreams, symbolic or dream experiences, because it shows that while in the physical body, in the physical surface consciousness, these capacities and even this courage is there, had the child fallen really in the water, the instinct of the mother would just make her jump, even if she didn't know how to swim. And being a good swimmer, she would have had no fear at all. In the dream, though, this does not happen. Instead, the fear comes. What does it mean? That the dream took place at a certain level of consciousness in which that fear exists. The fear is not of swimming. Remember, it's a symbolic dream. The fear is of this overwhelming force that is sweeping away the child. In that state, the instinct of a mother, which is in the biology, is not present. Now what the child represents for her is not just that instinctive bond, it is something else. And as she sweeps she sees this overwhelming current taking him away, the fear of that current is what paralyzes her in that grade of consciousness. Now, what does that mean in practice? In real life, when a certain crisis would have happened, let's say a few weeks, months, or years down, the force of that current which was seen in the dream would be felt in different situation, not as water, not as a river, but as a force of overwhelming circumstances, which is taking away something which is precious to her. It could be towards her son, it could be towards something which to her represents that. But the overwhelming force being such that within her there would be a paralysis. Remember, it has nothing to do with swimming. So the swimming instinct of the biology will not kick in. It will be this overwhelming fear of being carried away by the circumstances, which is too intense, too difficult to bear, to manage. And this would be the reality of physical life. And at that point, she would have watched helplessly that situation overwhelm her and pass on and take away something precious of her. Need not have been specifically the son. Maybe it was the son, maybe it was something else, but something which meant the equivalent of her own child, of herself, a part of herself put out, which is precious, perhaps even more precious than herself, being swept out by the overwhelming circumstances. The grade of consciousness which would have been so paralyzed was the grade in which the dream took place, and she experienced that paralysis. I want to show you this because you have to understand the dream is not merely something which happens as a symbolism. It represents parts of you activated in that situation, or inactivated or affected. Which same parts would be activated or inactivated or affected in exactly the same way in those material life circumstances. So it's like a, we may say, simulation where you're having a practice session exposed to that same force, but with a difference. And this was what happened in her case. When she wakes up, she realizes this. Of course, largely the mind is going in the interpretation, oh, my son, I didn't save, I can swim. It was largely on the superficial part. But the compulsion was, I want to have that opportunity again to be able to change that outcome. And as a result of that concentration and intensity, once again, that simulation situation is activated. But at this time, because she has prepared herself, I will even use the word, there was a sadhana of an intensity of purpose which had been built up through the whole day, and the intensity of wanting to intervene to change that outcome. All that gathered force now is activated in that grade of consciousness. That grade of consciousness is taught to overcome the fear, step in, and change the outcome. Now, again, from a very material perspective, because we think of dreams as something unreal, hallucinatory, and imaginary, but not understanding that these are realities on other planes, corresponding to gradations within you. So, in reality, she was able to change something in herself and be able to overcome the fear of that overwhelming force and save the child. So the specific intervention in the symbolism actually corresponded to a change of consciousness within her. And then immediately as she jumps into the river, she finds the water is just knee height and she is able to pick up the son and he's happy and safe. Now this is critical, typically happening in dreams or in out-of-body experiences. Because remember, in the domain which is non-material, form is plastic. And so everything you see, everything you experience is in some sense a reflection of the states of consciousness. When you fear, you set up a relationship where the thing that you fear now becomes large and overwhelming. You become small. When you face directly and shift your relationship of consciousness, you are no more afraid. In relation, you become large, that becomes small. In relative relation. The same circumstance, which was deep water, rushing, intense water, etc., which would have been overwhelming, the moment you changed your relationship with it and overcame the fear, the circumstance shifted. I would even presume, although she has not mentioned it, that the intensity of the water flow itself would have subsided when she felt it was knee height, and she would have said, oh, even the water is quite calm and still and not at all disturbing, not at all overwhelming. Because you change the relationship, the material dream circumstances, formed circumstances of the dream change accordingly. We'll come back to this many times in many ways, even in out-of-body experiences, when there is this question of challenges, dangers placed before you. What do you do? The fact that you face it without fear is one way by which you overcome. You ignore it as if it's a trivial thing. That's another way you overcome. But basically, you're changing your relationship with the thing. And as a result, that thing becomes the relationship that you have set. I will explore this a little later with a different question, but I want to highlight that what is happening in dream state is actually something happening in your consciousness, which corresponds to an actual material circumstances, where if you make that shift in the dream state, you have changed and therefore are able to act differently in the material circumstances of the world. And if the dream itself was as if a precursor to the events happening in the material world, the fact that you shifted things there will actually create a chain reaction and change the circumstances here physically. This is a point Sri Aurobindo makes in one of the letters. We will look at those texts and letters next time. We'll go much more deeply in Sri Aurobindo's writings. Today, I want to just take up many of the questions relating to the dreams. And once we understand this, those writings would make much more sense. So what you do in the dream state is not only an expression of what you are, but if in that state you're able to overcome and change yourself or change the circumstances, that reflects in the material circumstances, not only in the chain of influence, but in the growth that you have had, with which you're able to intervene differently. I recall one lady I had met. She was a teacher in some school, and she had always dreams of battles, struggles, and fights, where she would be this heroic person overcoming challenges, defeating, sometimes killing people as if in a battleground and things like that. It represents a part of her consciousness, which in this life was not at all expressed superficially, but a heroic part, a struggling part, an effort to overcome and change circumstances, defeat anything which is opposing the overall sense of direction of life, and so on. But the fact that that was being exercised there would have had its consequences here without even the person on the surface knowing. Assuming the dreams were completely forgotten, you would not even know that there had been an intervention by your own efforts on a higher level which has changed circumstances. And such things do happen. Remember, there are many levels on which things happen. So on other levels, we do have interactions sometimes and even interventions which have their consequences here. And we will read that in Sri Aurobindo's text probably next time. So I wanted to somewhat dwell on this. And then as it happens, she describes later in real life, there was a difficult situation. And this energy and focus and self-sacrifice, the willingness to lose yourself to save your child, but also with a certain forcefulness of being able to overcome without fear, without shrinking, without being paralyzed and helpless in the face of an intensity of a flow. That, having been learnt and overcome, had its consequence materially also. So we can go to the next question.
We have another question very similar from Caroline. I had a dream that was so vivid, I remembered it after a year. I was in the local swimming pool with my baby and we were in the water, and I was called away to do something and I left my baby in the water. I then realized that I left my baby and ran back to the pool and got there just as the baby was going under. I dived in and brought the baby up just in time. As I lifted the baby out of the water, it looked at me and said, "Sorry." I had some ideas of what the dream means, but the sorry is difficult to understand. Any light on this dream would be appreciated.
It's one of those dreams where it's very difficult to recognize because it is so different from material circumstances. And that's why you have to shift your consciousness a bit within. In this case, a child which is almost sinking in water, you pull it out and the child tells you sorry. Doesn't make sense, right? Because the water is not a drowning in the local pool. That's the imagery in which the physical mind has retained an experience of a deeper layer. And so on this level, it doesn't make sense. But if you go back to the full sense of it, the water represents a domain of consciousness. The baby, we mentioned last time, Sri Aurobindo's indication that often it represents the psychic being or some deeper part of which is close to the psychic being. So she's in the water inside. See, another thing with the swimming pool is when you're in the water, you're not wearing your regular clothes. You're in your minimal clothing. And in the water, you're fully immersed and you're with the baby. Immediately, the sense is of being in a deeper layer, immersed in a deeper layer, in presence of the psychic. And it was a state of consciousness or represented a phase of her life. But then something changes. Now she gets attracted to something which is outside the pool and she's called away to do something and leaves the baby behind. Because obviously the baby belongs to the water in the inner domain. She can't bring the baby. She has to leave it behind. By itself, it's not a problem. You just left it behind because it stays where it is. You go outside, you're called out. But then comes this where she remembers, I've left that behind. I've lost something. I'm about to lose something. So she rushes back to gain it. Meanwhile, what's happening? The baby which is in the water is gently drifting in, sinking into the water, going under. Which is what happens when the psychic influence is strongly in front. You ignore it long enough, after a while it begins to withdraw, sinking into the water, deeper waters of consciousness. She goes back because she senses she has lost something. She goes back and draws it out. And the child says, sorry, because it was withdrawing. Because it felt it was no more needed, its influence was no more received. It had begun to recede when she comes back and it says sorry, therefore. Sorry, I was withdrawing, but here I'm there. So it'll be interesting for Caroline to look whether in that period there was such a situation or immediately after. Sometimes these things are indicative of events to happen. Sometimes they indicate something that's already happening at that moment, but you're not conscious because it's happening somewhere deeper on other layers. So it'll be interesting for her to see if at that moment circumstances of life had called her out very strongly and she had begun to lose the contact with the inner presence. And then there was the corrective movement of reconnecting and drawing back that influence. It would be interesting to see, but it seemed to be almost obvious that this was a sense of the dream experience itself. And that's why it remains vividly, because it represents something so precious to the spiritual life. We can go to the next question.
We have two parts of San's question. So I'll read the first one. Can the same thing as sleep paralysis happen in any operation? My body didn't want to go for the surgery and just wanted to be left alone. A peace invocation has started automatically hours before, prior to my knowledge of what lay ahead of me, but the doctors felt it an emergency. Something in me was still invoking peace and still went numb much before and during the process, a bit detached from what was being done to the body, and I didn't like all the intense pressure of the situation. It was a local anesthetic, so I was fully awake during the procedure. But then midway felt like was passing away into a peace, which I had felt before going to the hospital, and kept trying to be awake and talking, which was hard, as the inner silence was blissful. Later in recovery, felt unusually cold and my body shivered for hours and needed layers of blankets and heated bed sheets before I felt normal again. It took almost a day to regain back a higher BP and normal body warmth. What was this reason for shivering? Even in recovery, the peace and stillness stayed with me for the next couple of days, except for the interference of doctors and pressure to take optional drugs and painkiller, which nothing in my being wanted. And this constant feeling of being pulled out from inside didn't feel good. I felt it would heal naturally if left alone with the intuition, but didn't know how to fight the outside fear and pressure. Any light on where I was drifting to and the numb stillness? Months before this day, when I had no idea of the situation, I had a dream of my body laying on a wooden table with family and doctors around while I was watching my body from above. Does this mean my physical body died in the dream in order for me to watch from above?
Okay. This is not directly of a dream experience, but it's the parallel. And his question is, does the same thing happen as when you wake up from a dream and you have sleep paralysis? And there's something similar which has happened, but in waking state during or before a surgery. So the second part of this is to do with the dream that did occur a few months before. And I would suggest that the dream itself was prophetic of this event. As you can see, the event was traumatic on many levels psychologically, maybe not so much biologically, but much more psychologically. And so it would have been sensed or anticipated as imminent and was represented in the dream state where you saw the thing happening from above as if. It does not mean that in the dream your body has to die. It's just a glimpse of, a symbolic glimpse of something which is about to happen. You must understand the inner worlds and higher worlds are all not primarily domains of form. So do not attach too much to form. Do not attach to meaning of form in the material world and in our physical senses. The sense of it is completely different, and you have to familiarize yourself to being in a domain which is, so to say, distinct from the surface material consciousness and its values. When you go deep into meditation, for example, the values are very different, the priorities are very different, your state, your perception, everything is different. Habituate yourself to that, and then from that you will understand many of these things better. So it does not have to be literal. In general, assume it is not literal, but it is indicative of, perhaps in this case, just the event which took place. And what was the event? There was a surgery to be made, and he didn't want to go to the surgery, and automatically before the surgery this invocation started. In the middle of it, he was drawn to the surgery because of an emergency. He feels himself detached from what's happening in the body, and although there was a local anesthetic, he is fully aware in the mind awareness, but it's as if passing away into a peace which I had felt before going to the hospital and kept trying to be in. And then, of course, he was required to speak, but the inner silence was blissful. So this movement of the withdrawal into a deep inner peace which took place almost spontaneously is what I want to point to. And I want to make a parallel from this to several aspects, spiritual as well as more material. This happened because your inner being pulled you deep within. It could also happen that you, on the surface, in order to avoid the strain, the struggle, the shock, choose as if to want to withdraw. It's the term used in modern psychology is dissociate, separate from your body. But when you separate in dissociation, where do you go? What is this you? And it could take many directions. It could simply be a part of your mind as if standing back separately and watching. But in this case, there was an inward pull. Two reasons. One is either externally, as you wanted to dissociate, a memory of a deeper immersion came forward to assist and helped you to do an inward dissociation rather than a sideways dissociation. If in this life you have already had experiences of deep meditation, it would be obvious. But from the nature of the question, it seems like that's not the case. So I would suggest it's coming from a past life. And the inner being sufficiently awake, that was the way. The second variation to this is, you may not have it, you may not have wanted to do it. The inner being surges forward at that point, either to infuse an influence into you during a crisis or to draw you back into itself, wrap you and hold you in its peace, in its depth, to prevent you from being overwhelmed by that difficult situation. Now, this is often what happens to people at the time of external crisis. Sometimes there's a sudden death in the family unexpectedly. Sometimes there's an accident that begins to happen and you're as if pulled back so that the intervention can be of a different kind. Or it does happen, you're in a kind of a shock. There's this phrase used, shell shock. There's a shell explosion, the loud bang, and you're in a state of shock. But what is the nature of the shock? That you're unable to function normally, your consciousness dissociated. And if there is something of the inner spiritual influence, it could have pulled you in. If it is a sideways dissociation, you're just dysfunctional, you're kind of lost, you lose your sense of identity, etc. It's a superficial thing. But if there is a deeper pulling, it draws you in, then there is this experience which he describes where it was passing into a deep peace. The inner silence was blissful, he says, and he didn't want to come out with the interference of the doctors giving all the medicines. The constant feeling of being pulled out from inside didn't feel good. I felt it would heal naturally if left alone with the intuition. This came because you were in a deepened, interiorized state. And coming out is almost such a loss of that deep peace and freedom and joy that it feels like not worth it. But still, in that state, you have the deep conviction that everything will be set right. If you were to come out and lose that inner state, all the usual reactions of panic, fear, worry might automatically kick in. If from this inner state, you were able to infuse this deep peace into those outer parts, and especially in the parts where the surgery was done, or the layers upon which the imprint of the surgery was held, then it would have actually accelerated the healing. But even if doing nothing, there was a certain infusion, so intuitively you felt that it was fine. But he says, I didn't know how to fight the outside fear and pressure. This would be the way. You stay in this and gently, very slowly infuse like a vibration, like an influence, like a perfume spreading out. Infuse it into those layers where you feel the fear and pressure. And as you infuse it, you will feel those parts relax, calm down, become still and quiet, begin to reflect the inner state. Now, all this, as I'm describing, you will immediately recognize as the very nature of the spiritual process. You go within to a deeper or a higher consciousness, experience it, remain immersed in it, and then you have to infuse it all the way into the outer. If you don't, you just come out, well, you've left it behind. Outside, everything is the same. You lost an opportunity. But when you take the trouble to infuse in this way, you can feel the shift that takes place and the change in the outer consciousness. This must be done. So from the experience itself, it seems, and I would suggest for Sun, that there is a deeper spiritual, let's say, past work done, which made possible for you not only to easily come into that state, but stay in it easily. But now you must use this as a reference to consciously go into that state. And you can use the memory of it, recall the peace, recall the deep sense of inward immersion, and so to say, let yourself slide. Let yourself be carried into the feel that the memory brings back, and let yourself be pulled almost. What happened in that crisis situation was you were drawn in, you were pulled by who? Your own deeper ranges. Allow yourself to be drawn in the same way. No more needing a crisis externally. And then, one of the things which happens when you are so inwardly drawn and deeply drawn, where your consciousness withdraws from the surface layers, automatically your consciousness is no more identified with the surface body. As a result, it feels as if the outer layer becomes completely still or even numb. It's a pleasant numbness. It's not a disturbing numbness. You are inwardly centered. The outer layers become numb. It happens for most people when you go into deep states of meditation. But then when you come back, instead of reacting, oh, my body is numb, blood circulation is cut off, and you start shaking your legs, instead you just let your consciousness once again infuse. Instead of agitating the surface, you leave them quiet and slowly infuse what you have received in that inner state. Slowly infuse into it. And you'll find within a few minutes, all the sensations return. It has nothing to do with blood circulation. The numbness is filled with the warmth and all else what she describes later. And the peace will fill into it. And so when you come back to your surface, you will feel the continuity of the deeper peace. Maybe not with the same depth, not with the same denseness, but the continuity of it will be there as an influence. So initially you will do this. Later what will happen, you will be able to hold both poises, as if some part of you is deeply immersed there and another part of you is receiving its influence in the surface, in the stillness. And then something else can happen later. You, as this integrates more and more, you can actually live in the deep peace and literally flow it into all the outer parts, acting, working through those outer parts. There'll be no more the sense of numbness because you'll not have withdrawn. The initial need for withdrawal is almost necessary to be able to go to that kind of depth at first. Later, when you integrate to the surface and are able to go back and forth and a continuity is built and you can live in a double awareness and then eventually live from the inner flowing into the outer, you will no more have the numbness. But you will have the full impact of that inner state. So I'm explaining why there was this numbness in the deep peace, and it felt cold and the body shivered for hours, needing layers of blankets, heated bed sheets before I felt normal, he says. Because actually it was not a physical cold. It was the state of having withdrawn from the physical that the body was numb, Biologically, the temperatures could be brought back, but you were not feeling the warmth. You were feeling it still cold and numb because your consciousness was withdrawn. You infuse the consciousness back into it, and you'll find immediately it takes care of that cold. So it was not a physical cold, so it did not help that you put the blankets or the heaters. So I think this should be clear enough for what happened. I'm just trying to see if there are other aspects. Interference of doctors, etc., and the painkillers and drugs felt an interference because it was artificially pulling you out, whereas being within felt so good. But I'm interested to know what happened later. After this crisis passed, did you find yourself suddenly thrown out, or did it gradually emerge? And if it gradually emerged, were you able to go back in? Did you even attempt to go back in? These would be the important things. If you have not, I would suggest you do this. Use this as an occasion, use this as an entry into a spiritual depth of experience. And it may help, if you like, to look at the guided meditation in the about 2 years ago in September, I had uploaded on the same channel. It's in the playlist of the Evenings with Sraddhalu series also. I think just after episode number 84, between 84 and 85, there's a title which is called Guided Meditation for Descent of Peace. You might like to explore that, where there's a concentration above head and the descent of peace that takes place, which will take you to a similar state. And maybe initially not fully, but if you get it fully, even in the first time, wonderful. Otherwise, after a few repetitions of deepening consciously, you'll find you can easily get back to that same depth. But then you must consciously work on integrating in this way. But this shows the spiritual potential and what is waiting from within, except that what happens for many of us, and I've seen this in so many cases of people who have a spiritual potential, we are so busy with the outward turn, it needs a crisis for the inner intervention, something to draw you in or something to infuse from within out to seize the situation, to help in the crisis, and so on. You will remember the example Sri Aurobindo narrates when he was on the horse carriage and there was an accident about to happen in Baroda, and he found something of the inner being surged out, overwhelmed the circumstances, seized the situation and prevented the accident. And he's surprised at what's happening. He meaning the surface person. But you don't have to wait for a crisis. Rather, this would be an experience, an entry point. Use it to build and deepen your spiritual life. We can go to his next question.
His second part, please elaborate on dreams of family members if they are living. It is about parts attached to them, also about that family, close one, like a parent, immediately after death, and even 2-3 years after. Regular dreams, sometimes in gaps of few weeks, months, where you can see entire family together, again, like eating together or traveling or enjoying simple moments with them, or harder circumstances, tussles, similar to intenser, lighter to the tussles during your life together on earth, or sometimes they are trying to make amends and sometimes justify or do more of the same thing to justify. Or sometimes neutral dreams of just seeing them, what these different scenes means. Are they actually visits?
It could be any of these. And I'm taking the question more generally because all these possibilities are likely. But then depending on the specific nature of the dream and the state and the quality and the way it was registered, that you would make out which of these it would be. For example, if you were to surround yourself with pictures of your family members, living or those who have passed on, think about it all the time. Remember those events, miss them, feel them, long for them. Naturally, this state in which you are will reflect in the dream state, in which either the same longing will be enormously amplified, or you will feel them close to you and you will feel the thing which you're missing, which you're seeking now, and experience them. Now, depending on what happens on the grade of the dream, it could simply be a reflection of something which is within you, in which case obviously they are not there. Or it's possible that your intense longing and perhaps they're missing you also makes for a contact that takes place in the subtle bodies. Need not be in a full exteriorization. It can be still just in a part of the consciousness that is as if projected out, often in the domain which is what we will call the mental body. Because in the mental body, you don't even need to exteriorize in order to be able to enter in contact with things. You think of someone and a part of your mind has already touched their mind, but it's only on that level. So in the dream state, if you are thinking of them, they are thinking of you and missing you, and something happens and touches, which you will then recall on waking up as having met them. But when they meet you, what happens? Depending on the nature of your relationship, you have the tussles or the intense or light, but replica of the similar things which used to happen in the physical domain. So again, what value does it have? Nothing particular. You're only replicating what happens here in consciousness terms. But if we draw on the examples from the previous discussions, you decide, in the dream, I don't want those conflicts, and make a change there. Make amends, as you have seen them do. You change something there, you come back on the physical world, something will have shifted. You don't need to always do it in the dream state. You can do it in the physical consciousness. So you are in your waking state. What is it that is the root cause of this tussle that you have with, let's say, a family member? And you observe in yourself this part, this anxiety, this fear, this upset, or this point of discord. And you consciously dissolve and change and replace it with a positive relation. And sometimes these are deep rooted. You're not always conscious. And then you find the moment your vibrational state here has changed, it will reflect in the dream state. It will reflect in your material circumstances. When they call you, you'll find suddenly the tensions have dissolved, etc. And sometimes you can see it's quite complex because it may be justified, your upset, your tension, because of their constant provocation. You've built up a certain reaction. Can you actually dissolve that and be free of it even when the provocations come? That's difficult. But if you're able to do that and hold that, then you'll find suddenly something of the provocations dissolving or softening up or changing mode. So it was something which my teacher MP Pandit had shared, and it was a guidance that the mother gave to him. She said, all these people he was harassed by a lot of people who were jealous or had issues with him. And she said, do you know what to do with your enemies? First she had said simply be unaffected and equal. But then she said, you really want to solve it? This is the way to go. She said, you must love. And Panditji commented when he was sharing this example, he said that he has to accept that he couldn't do it. It was too difficult. But it depends, of course, on the circumstances. But when you can do it, first you simply dissolve whatever distress you have. Bring a state of general equality. And then you can actually flow in love. You don't have to love them for their nastiness. What you do rather is put out a general perception or relation of love with all. Make it neutral. Make it collective. And then when you have that, occasionally when this X passes before you, that neutrality or that love which is generally turned to the collective will still be present. Occasionally you'll find the ripples of the old habit popping up, but then it's easy to dissolve when you already have this base. But if you sit down and say, I'm going to love X who has hurt me so much, it doesn't work. Instead, you're pumping more energy into them with this distress, which only creates more of the reaction. I'm going to go off in a bit of a tangent, but you will understand why. But it goes a little beyond the scope of our discussion. What actually happens each time you think of somebody with distress, and maybe the distress is justified, but each time you think of somebody with distress, your consciousness is thinking of them. And so let's say at the mental plane, at least there's a point of contact. And then there is an emotional distress. Where do you think that distress goes? Because you've just created a link, the distress flows directed at them. Not intentionally. But since it's associated with them, that distress now hangs around and eventually wanders off. With the link already present, touches them at a level which is subliminal. They are not conscious. At that moment, spontaneously, for no reason at all, they are led to think of you or remember you. And at the moment where the consciousness turns and thinks of you, they are hit by this bundle of distress, which is yours for them. But now when it hits them, it's felt as their distress towards you now. So when they do that, and their distress pops up for no reason, they say, oh, I don't know why I don't like this person. That distress, dislike, comes back to you eventually. And you've actually built a connection of attention which is building and builds over days, over weeks. Now, the incident initially in which the problem started might be trivial. You're working together. X was in a bad mood for a reason unconnected with you. They're struggling with some problem they've had with someone in their family or some financial situation. When you went to them with a lot of affection, you got a response which was gruff and harsh. They may not even be conscious that they were like that because they were in some distress already. You come back and say, this person does not like me. Why is this person so nasty to me? And you start brooding and start this vicious cycle. Throwing that energy, which touches them, comes back and forth and builds an intensity, a bridge of distress, of disturbed energy, linking you. The result is now 2 weeks later, you meet for the first time after that incident, and suddenly there's this tension in the air, and it justifies all your worries if you're not careful. Or if you're careful, you notice, where did this come from? I cannot think of any physical circumstance that would justify this tension, that it's there. So you dissolve it. And this was the key that the mother gave. To dissolve it, you can of course start by a process of cultivating the opposite, which would be a good way, cultivating neutrality, etc. But you really want to dissolve it, the most rapid, the most direct way is if you can melt it all with love. And as I said, it doesn't have to be towards that person necessarily. It can be generally put out to all. And it includes that person incidentally. But in that which you put out, this tendency that you have to build that link of distress dissolves. The link of distress you have built up begins to dissolve because you're not feeding it anymore. The distress that comes from them, which is now the habit of this link, as it reaches you, it meets this love and dissolves. The vicious cycle is not only broken, it begins to dissolve rapidly. Not just with them, but with everybody, because it was a general turn. And if you can work on it, and don't worry if you slip occasionally, don't worry if something rattles you when you meet them or whoever, because the distress is justified. But you can't be feeding it. You can't be living and wallowing in it. The love allows you to break free from the need to wallow. You'll still be careful. You'll still be hesitant of certain kinds of trust or interaction, but at least you will not be wallowing in that and feeding this cycle. So the love generally put out in this way, as a relationship with all, and generally to life itself, to the world, allows you to most rapidly dissolve these things. So I've gone into a bit of a tangent, but it's an opportunity to build on this all relationship with family members. And I come back to the question now. Whatever this, if in the dream you have tussles which are harder or lighter, that's not what you want. Well, start changing them now in your waking state. What is also interesting in the example of some of the dreams you've mentioned is that sometimes you have these dreams where they are trying to make amends, or sometimes trying to justify, or do more of the same thing to justify. And that's actually this what we were describing, this links built up, which are habitual, mechanical on some inner layers. Break that cycle with this love. Do it in your waking state. If you can, from that, extend it into, as you drift into sleep, let that love turn to all family members, all friends, all beings if you want. Go into sleep with that. What will happen is this will begin to dissolve. many of the dreams you're describing seem to be just representations of these kinds of distress links that have formed on those levels. But coming to general question about family members and seeing members from the past or who have passed on, as a general rule, often Sri Aurobindo says the death of somebody is indicative of a dissolution of some part in you which was attached, which was sticky, which corresponded to that grade of consciousness of that relation. So I think that largely covers. We can go to the next question.
Madhuri. Once I was awake early morning. Suddenly all space and things around me was turned into vast blue sky full of stars. I saw a man sitting on galaxy plate, came near to me, whirling and widening, and turned into Shri Baby Krishna with his toes in mouth, smiling at me. I couldn't recognize even him as Krishna. Suddenly it struck my mind to bow down as he is Krishna. I went into reverse direction. And then
we'll just look at this first.
Yeah, okay.
Early morning dreams are generally indicative of something which is close to the material plane because your consciousness is coming back. And that's generally when you have the precognitive dreams, because that layer, when you perceive things happening, they're closest to the material and are therefore likely to happen. If you perceive things on a higher level, by the time they come to the material, there are too many interventions and changes. It may not happen. So that early morning stage is interesting because it's the closest to the material. And then Madhuri describes how all space around turned into this vast blue sky full of stars. Notice the sense of that blue sky full of stars and immediately of the sense of the cosmos and opening to a wide, vast cosmos. And then there is this man sitting on a galaxy plate. I'm assuming that you're seeing the galaxy perhaps as an image. So it's an opening to some kind of a vast cosmic kind of consciousness. And then as this form emerges, it becomes this child with toes in mouth smiling, baby Krishna. So in the tradition, for example, it is described how in this dissolution from one cycle to the next of one kalpa, that is when one age, gigantic cycle of age dissolves and everything is as if extinguished and a new cycle is born. In between, it is the divine Lord as this child with his toe in his mouth playing. That's all you see. That's all that remains. Because the whole game is his. And it's an image which is quite classic traditionally. But again, it need not draw on that. What I'm saying is it is a perception of the divine playing at the heart of the whole cosmos, in the cosmic consciousness. And the mind takes a while to register it as a familiar form of, and with the name of Sri Krishna. And once it recognizes this, then the whole experience withdraws. So it's as if from above something descended, touched you, gave you an experience and withdrew. And again, this is to highlight that actually in our sleep state, often, especially when we are on a spiritual path, we may receive such touches of consciousness, infusions, even experiences are given to us, because often in those states we are much more receptive than in the embodied state. And in those states, one can even receive and integrate without memory remaining on the surface. So what will happen is something, so to say, trickles down through repeated series of experiences, things begin to change. But if on the surface you have no memory of it, all these changes are happening on some inner layers and they take a long time to come to the surface. And that's unfortunately too slow as a sadhana. And this is the reason why it is extremely helpful to take the trouble to bridge the gap between the inner and the outer. And if you can consciously do this a little bit, maybe by some regular practice of meditation. I don't know if Madhuri has a regular practice of meditation, but I would suggest doing one, but not one which is superficial, not one where your consciousness stays on the surface, but really withdraw, go deep within, and immersion in the presence within you, whatever means you use. But stay in the deep immersion, and in that immersion, turn and open to these inner and higher ranges of your consciousness. And if this could be given to you in the dream state, and remembering only a vague imprint of it, when you go within consciously and open, you will receive the same and perhaps receive much more completely and be able to retain it and allow it to impact your surface consciousness and your life. So again, I would suggest this is a indication of a deeper spiritual potential. And do not stop with superficial kinds of meditation, but allow your consciousness to be drawn deeper within and open from within. And then you will find you have access to these things and much more that is perhaps waiting. You can go to her next question.
Second, in another dream, I was on a dead body stretcher made of bamboo kept on fire. I was not scared. My body was burning and breaking into pieces, and I was a little confused what was happening. And I was talking to somebody, feeling the hole. I could see my body burning from outside, and I was in the body talking at the same time. If these experiences has little indications from spiritual perspective, and I'm not able to explore, can you please help me in getting those indication and significance?
Yes. So obviously the first experience was of a spiritual kind, as I've mentioned. The second one also is indicative of a certain transition, perhaps. So at the same time, she feels herself in the body while it is burning and being broken up, so to say, and at the same time standing outside and observing. And the thing is, while in the body is talking. I would suggest this represents the two layers of your life. The superficial surface life and the inner, deeper spiritual life. Lack of the link, they're separate. And this one is talking, it is doing its thing. And confused, breaking up, burning, which is really what our life is about. We are being consumed as we travel the journey of life meaninglessly, pointlessly. And all the circumstances wear out the body, break us up, and basically we age, break down, and so to say, die out. Lose hope, lose enthusiasm, lose energy, lose sense of purpose. Basically, that's a fragmentation of the whole outer personality. That's what you see in an aimless, meaningless, purposeless life. So there's this layer that's happening here, and then there's this other part which is totally different, and a lack of continuity, a lack of connection between the two. And even for the fact that you recognize that there's spiritual sense to it, but can't translate on the surface mind is also an indication that it had a deeper meaning, obviously. So again, to me, this indicates the potential. The inner being is much more ready, much more receptive. For whatever reason, Sri Aurobindo points out, it is often the case of the hard outward turn given by education and life circumstances, which hides, conceals the deeper spiritual readiness. And if you're able to reverse that, teach your consciousness to be able to withdraw from this hard outward superficial turn and withdraw, turn in and turn inward. First, use the reference of your own deeper soul's aspiration and its influence. Turn from there to the experience or the closeness felt with the presence of the Divine Mother, in whatever way you're able to turn in this way. Remain in that, immerse in that, but build on this every day. A little more each day, a little nudge more, a little deeper, a little more complete, and a movement of opening and self-giving, becoming more and more complete each day in relation to the divine, in immersion with the soul's influence or the divine presence. Just work on this. The inner is ready. The outer, by education, is being given a hard outward turn. And as it starts turning, you'll find very rapidly the inner and outer will begin to meet and a bridge formed. And your whole inner spiritual life will open up rapidly. I think there's not much more to say. There's only to be done. We go to the next question.
And Rick Bob. I had several experiences in my dream which have left a permanent memory with vivid details of environment, location, etc., some of which seem to defy laws of science, huge size of the mother filling my room, etc. These experiences, I am able to recall every detail. Question, how can I integrate and learn from these experiences?
Yes. It's a similar example of a rich inner life, and somehow the outer is still not able to connect directly with it. So the fact of vivid recall from those dream experiences shows that what is happening within is very much not only real but also close enough that you're able to recall. The missing element is the outer part being able to consciously open and maybe build a link to those inner layers where these experiences take place, which can begin with a very simple basic practice of meditation of the kind that I have already described. And once that begins, you'll find many things begin to integrate rapidly. You may also want to consciously follow a practice of recalling the dream and noting down in detail, but be careful not to bring the dream memory to the surface only. Rather, hold that in between stage. I mentioned this last time. You might want to review that. As you emerge from the dream state to the surface mind and translate into the physical brain memory, before translating, you hold that poise. From that poise, you will recall the dream state and the quality and grade of consciousness, which is much more fluid and plastic and real. You'll be able to recall that and stay in it. And then slowly infuse into the physical. And at that point, when you do this, you will not have this problem where you are perplexed that it defies the laws of science. The, so to say, laws of science are not laws, and science is very superficial in its understanding even of what it knows. Rather, we recognize the material world, a domain of matter, is a domain of form, and therefore rigidity of form is normal here. But the moment you shift in, even into the subtle physical, your subtle physical body is somewhat plastic. Sometimes it can grow large, sometimes it can shrink and become weak and small. And you will experience that and you will see it. And in the dream state, obviously, that plasticity of form is what you're seeing. Huge size of the mother filling your room is because her presence is infinite. It is cosmic. It not only fills the whole universe, it transcends the universe, is larger than the universe and can embrace the universe and can even rise above space and time and embrace space and time itself from a poise outside. And each of these are, so to say, gradations on which you can meet the Divine Mother and relate to her or even experience her presence as yours because you're a part of her. So this huge size of the mother filling your room is only the way your brain mind interprets the experience of her vastness as held in your smallness. Does that make sense? Your room is your little world, your little body consciousness and your small littleness. Her consciousness being large and registered, held in that. So if I had to give a symbolic analogy, this gigantic ocean and a little wave top down leaning into your little consciousness, your little bowl, your little room, which is your world on the physical level in the body, and you're holding that, but she's too big. But the mind translates it into a physical form because it needs a physical form to be able to hold and recognize her, which is fine. And so that's how the dream is recognized. I'd be interested to have heard other laws of science being defied. But once you get the hang of this, you'll find largely it has to do with sizes and shapes and the ability to meld one shape into another and not being bound to rigidity of form. And that would take care of the bulk of the nature of the experiences. Again, the suggestion would be in your own deeper parts, you're opening to a wider experience and intimacy of the mother's larger consciousness. Take the trouble, the same guideline I've suggested before, take the trouble to consciously turn your awareness inward. Do some kind of a deeper practice of meditation where you bridge from the surface to the inner. To all those whom I have suggested this, I would say, if it helps you, start from that guided meditation for descent of peace. It will give you immediately the sense of what it's like to be disengaged from the surface physical layers and be more immersed in your subtle physical body. and then being able to bridge these two. And from the subtle physical awareness, you'll find you can easily open to the deeper and wider full ranges because it is much more plastic, much more conscious, much more receptive. So use that. It could be a helpful starting point. Otherwise, whatever works. We'll go to the next question.
There's Saman. Shall we go with this question or
Yes.
Ash? Yeah, okay.
Okay, maybe we'll keep it for later. Let me just look at the chat box.
Yes.
There are quite a few things which have come. Yes, Tutun confirms that, yes, the water was calm. Once she had jumped into it, everything had changed. Shiva shares, long ago, my recently deceased grandfather came in my dream and advised on how to deal with the property to avoid family tussles. The elders didn't listen and his dire prediction manifested. Yes, it's a fact that when people have just passed on and it's still recent, they're quite close to the material domain, they do try, where they feel things have been left unfinished, to convey a message. And unfortunately, because we live so physically identified, that we only register these things in the dream state where we are not so physically bound in biology. And having received it, you come back to the waking consciousness and lose it. Imagine the frustration on their part. They come to you first while you're in this half sleep dream state. They convey something which you barely register. If at all you register, you say, ah, yes, that's a good point. And poof, you go back into this half sleep dozing state. And then you wake up and you've forgotten everything. And perhaps they tried several times and then they give up. There's a very interesting thing which Mark describes. Again, I come back to Mark Aurobindo. And many of you have asked, where can you buy it? And I've put the link in today's description. The website is diptipublications.com. DIPTI publications.com. And it is the only place you get Mark's book in English because it's the first time we have translated. He narrates this because of this ability that he had of the opening to the subtle sight, obviously subtle sound. He would sometimes see these beings who had just passed on, and they would want to pass a message through him to those who have their family members. And of course, on his part, he just refused. He says, no, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I don't want to play this game. But he narrates incidents here where occasionally it would happen where he felt it was needed. He was, for example, one narration he was driving on the road and there's a girl who's a hitchhiker and he receives this suggestion that he has to stop for her. So he stops, takes her on. It turns out she has just lost her parents recently and her parents are trying to convey a message through him to her. So he just conveyed the message and then dropped her off. But beyond that, he would just cut off and say, no, you don't want to get into that trip because it's a very messy trip. But nevertheless, there are situations where it can be helpful. But the point I'm making is, yes, it does happen. They want to communicate. How can they? We are so deeply asleep in our waking state. And then when we go into dream state, it's the same sleep that we are continuing in the dream state. Unconscious. We live unconsciously here, and so our dream states are unconscious. If we become more conscious here, we can also become more conscious in the dream state. And in a sense, it's also a reflection of our spiritual growth. Does not mean in terms of what higher consciousness you access, but how much the higher consciousness is integrated with the surface layers. It's a measure of that. And when our surface layers have been sufficiently awakened, then that will also reflect in the dream state. So that's an interesting example that Shiva shares. Madhuri comments also how she saw her grandfather in dream at the time when he passed away. And the telegram came later. And she says, a little child was in his lap and he was injected and was not more. I don't quite get that. Okay. Then she heard the voice of her grandfather that he is no more. It was much more than a dream. Yes, exactly. At the time when they leave the body, there's a period initially of transition. It can take a few minutes, hours, or a few days, depending on the degree to which you have prepared yourself or are conscious on the other side. And once you're there, you might want to reach out to those who are loved. And again, you're free to wander in your subtle body. It's like an out of body experience, except now you don't come back to the physical body. There's not much difference. You go out, you meet the people you would want to, except that they are blind, deaf, and dumb and asleep in their little obsession of their little life. And you can only tap into them, if at all, in their sleep bubble, as Mark describes. But if you're a little bit conscious, then you register it in dream state, in dream form, or otherwise, sometimes in vision form, and so on. Shiva's question, can one consciously enter another person and give a message in the dream while still being alive? I would say you don't need to enter another person. You can convey the message as you are, even now, isn't it? Every time you think of someone, you are actually conveying, there's a point of contact, isn't it? The problem is, first of all, when we have that, that's one of maybe thousands of automatic, mechanical, meaningless agitations and activities of your mind and thoughts. So effectively, your energy is dispersed in 1,000 different connections. Think of all the things you're thinking. And this is the case for most people when you sit down to meditate, suddenly all the thoughts begin to pop up. No, you just become aware of all the thoughts which were mechanically happening anyway, which you were not aware of because you were busy with something else. That's the dispersal of energy you have. The first thing you would do is make your mind completely quiet, or as quiet as you can. Then you can direct it to a particular thing. And then naturally it is an amplifier. It's a huge amplification of whatever it is you're directing your thought to. And then you can further develop the power of that communication. The problem on the other side is, again, it's a chaotic noise. A little nudge coming in is not enough to have registration. Unless the person was already intuitive or connected with you, and then something may be registered or not. Or when registered, it is interpreted in various ways with their own forms. Unless the other side also there is a sufficient clarity and receptivity, very likely you will not be able to get much. And then after all that, if you really try to communicate in this way, you're very likely going to be hacked, because if you can communicate, some other being can impersonate and communicate. And unless the person has a deeper intuition, they would not be able to distinguish. So my point is, yes, it's possible. You can send a message. You can even send a message in dream state or even in non-dream state. The problem is more of the receptivity and the unreliability of any such communications. But what you can do, which is more useful perhaps, is when somebody is in distress or in some difficulty, you can send a wave of a vibration of support, calm, peace, or help of some kind, love, affection, light, to a person who is going through distress. And that would be received, even if not consciously, it would affect and influence their circumstance. Or even to somebody who's just disembodied, who has just left the body, and you can do the same. And it would have a far greater impact because they would be affected more intensely. Turbanless says, I had a dream when I was chanting Gayatri for a long time in my room. Then in my dream, my father came in and come and bless you. And I was furious and started scolding him, as I felt it was a negative entity taking his form. Then the next scene was in the kitchen where he was trying to attack and clenched his feet ready for battle. But I was scared and the dream ended. Can I control the narrative? Can I stop dreams? Does a dream state create karma? If it comes to the question of karma, yes, everything creates ripples physically and of course in dream state. There is this very famous story in the Indian tradition of the king Harishchandra, who gave his word and never broke his word, and that was the great ideal at that point, at least in the larger evolution. And so in dream state, Indra comes to him and asks for his kingdom, and he gives his kingdom. Then he wakes up, and in the physical domain, King Indra comes and says, you promised to give your kingdom in the dream, or three boons. And then as a result, he is now sent into the most horrible conditions, and he's lost his kingdom, etc. So he has to stick to the word he gave in dream state. That's the ideal of the story, at least. So yes, there are consequences, but the question is, if you give a word in a state of drunkenness, does it apply? Was it really your word, or the drink which was making you give your word? And if in dream state you're unconscious and you make a commitment in that, does it really bind you? Of course, in the story, perhaps Harishchandra is conscious, but then I would ask, why would he promise something in that state? I don't know. But I'm just saying that it's really not too different out of body or in within the body. The difference is of grade of consciousness. If in dream state you're just in this mechanical, helpless rush of subconscious impulses, it has as little value as something done in that state in the physical consciousness. If there is an intentional, clear focus in dream state, meditation state, out of body state, or in physical waking state, it would have equivalent results perhaps, or consequences. But to come back to turbanless dream, the fear was that when this person came in the form of her father, the fear was that it was some entity that had taken its place, and then it clenched its fist and got ready for battle. So very likely it was one such. You sensed it, but it could also be a fear that it might be an entity which then creates a shift in the nature of the dream. So all depends on whether it is purely a dream, which is then a formation and a projection of your own consciousness, or was it a reflection of an out-of-body experience that actually took place, or a symbolic representation of something that actually took place. Doesn't matter. The point is, yes, you can control the narrative, you can stop the dream, you can change the dream. But that means you must work on becoming conscious or partially conscious in the dream state. And we discussed that last time, so I won't repeat. But work on it, and then you'll find you can direct your dreams in the dream state. But you can also choose to have clearer, positive, higher dreams by changing the state in which you enter the sleep. And finally, what I said was, the more you become conscious, the more you live your life centered in a spiritual aspiration, the more that state will continue in your dream. That your dream also will be an expression of your spiritual aspiration. And then things can happen or be done there which would actually be a continuation of your sadhana. Revati speaks of being in the dream state where she could levitate and fly and things like that. It's great fun, yes, because the subtle body does not have weight. So very often these are registrations of some activity in the subtle body, semi-consciously experienced, which then remain as the dream. All of us have these dreams where we fly. And especially when you are in a lucid dream, the first thing you want to do is, I'm conscious, I'm dreaming. That means I can fly. And you choose to float, and you float off. Sandhya says, almost every night I get two conflicting dreams. One is full of love and sweet things, like children and flowers. Another dream is full of negative things, like violence, killing, warlike situations. And when I am about to get up, the two dreams get mixed up. I would say observe which layer. The two dreams are taking place on different layers. If you can recognize, you don't have to give a name, feel the quality of consciousness where this takes place and where that takes place. Very likely this negative dreams are happening in some gradation of the vital consciousness. And then if you can hold that quality of consciousness and in your waking state become aware of that grade within you, and consciously turn that part and open it to a higher light and bring the light and peace into that part, infuse and dissolve this disturbance. The disturbance could be coming from two causes. One, that within you there is this tendency of agitation, which could be from distress in relation to people or circumstances, but in that layer is held that agitation. Or in that layer you're open to influences from outside, which makes that when you go into that sleep state, that layer, which is relatively low and close to the physical, opens out into the lower vital worlds and receives all these impressions or influences, which then you register as the dreams. Either way, if you're open, then you learn to close. If the agitation is within you, then you would learn to quiet and calm it with peace and light brought in. But if you're open on that level, you will find in your life you will get suggestions and nudges on that level which will affect your behavior. You might find in a situation where you would want to be quiet, suddenly something rushing in, seizing you and creating distress, triggering conflict and so on. But if you can correct that, it will stop in the dream, but it will also stop in the waking state. This vulnerability will change. Rampal asks what to do before you go to bed for protection. Well, the one thing you do is to put yourself entirely and exclusively in relation to the divine. You can do this by turning of awareness. You can do it by an accompaniment of a visual. One way of doing the visual would be to as if feel the mother's presence and surround yourself with it, forming as if like a cocoon, like a shell, like a body. Or another way would be become aware of your own aura, of your own consciousness, which is cocoon shaped somewhat, and open it to the mother's light and peace and force. Invoke her to fill you and surround you, or even surround your aura, surround your cocoon. Or become aware of her presence, which is everywhere in the world, and immersing yourself in it, feel her wrapping you in her arms, holding you like this child as you drift into sleep with your cocoon. So you see, there are many variations, many ways one could do it. Whatever works for you easily, I've just indicated a few. And something may come to you spontaneously, which may be your way. But two elements are critical. One is becoming aware of the totality of your awareness. So it's not just one part that is in protection, the rest exposed. As much as possible, the totality of your awareness, you must become aware first. And second is putting this whole of you, or as much as you're able to get of the whole of you, in relation to the divine, which then envelops, closes, supports, holds, infuses, fills the whole of you. Therefore, entirely open to the divine, exclusively given to the divine. These two keywords come again and again. But to whatever extent you're able to, you put yourself in this relation, and then slowly in that state you drift into sleep, with the intention that this should stay throughout the night. And generally that is enough. Very rarely there may be a part in you which has a persistent opening, which is not included in this movement of opening and protection. It has a persistent opening to something of a lower grade of other worlds, and things leak in through that. But when you persist in this, gradually that part will be taken in, or with a prayer, a concentration for help, where you're aware of that part, you bring it in consciously into the domain of your wholeness, give, open and give yourself. Bit by bit, this will be overcome. But this would be the easiest way. The form is secondary. Trying to see if there's anything else. Okay, there are several questions which relate to the OBE, which we will take up next time, the out-of-body experiences. And that's it, I think, for today. We can end with this idea that before you go to sleep, you put yourself in relation to the Divine Mother for protection. But then why not live in that state at all times, isn't it? Think about it. If we can start our day with the same intention, becoming conscious of all we are, all that we are about to do, all that we intended to do, take it all and open it to her, invoke her light and force in you, but also in the circumstances that you're going to engage with the whole of your day ahead of you. And enter at least with this. If possible, during the day, many times, remember that, recall that, invoke the Divine Presence, Divine Mother's help and force, simply by remembering and turning, opening, here, your help in this moment. And then again, you lose yourself in the work, no problem. And then at the end of the day, a similar process where you gather all that was done in the day, all the efforts you put, all the work done, take it all up and offer it to her and say, now you act on this. This is the effort put. These are the energies put out for whatever outcomes that you thought best. And open it to her and say, now you act, do what is needed. Combine this with yourself, all of you taken up, and put yourself now in her hands and say, here, I am also yours. Hold me, carry me in your arms as I drift into sleep and slide into sleep. So in a sense, with some variation, the overall sense of the relationship with the divine, not only at the time of entry into sleep, but also at the time of beginning of the day would be of help. And then perhaps many points of contact during the day. And this becomes naturally our support in the sadhana. Let's hold this as an intention. For those of you who feel inclined to put this into practice, let's take this up as a practice, at least for the coming few days through the rest of the week. And if it helps you, you might extend it into your life in some form or other. Let's all concentrate in this aspiration